Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the window was ajar. The breeze carried in a faint hint of something unplaceable, enough to pause but not linger. The coffee maker buzzed quietly in the background, its rhythmic sound providing a curiously soothing backdrop to the morning routine. The newspapers remained untouched, stacked neatly on the table, headlines visible but unread. The hallway seemed longer today, the footsteps echoing just a fraction slower than usual. I glanced at the scattered mail, noticing an envelope with no return address but left it unopened. I poured another cup of coffee, setting 2 mugs on the counter. Though only one was needed, I left them both there. The second mug had become a habit, though I couldn't remember when it started. Perhaps it was after the first time I found the kitchen door unlocked in the morning. Or maybe it began when the neighbor mentioned seeing lights in my house while I was supposedly away. These details drift together now, like sediment settling in still water, impossible to separate or arrange in any meaningful order. The envelope sits unopened still. Its edges are crisp, the paper quality suggesting something official, something that demands attention. Yet every morning I walk past it, and every evening I notice it again, unchanged. There's a comfort in its presence, a constant in a world where small things have begun shifting without explanation. The coffee maker's buzz has grown familiar, almost conversational, filling the spaces where other sounds used to live. I think about the morning I realized the routine had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would alarm a casual observer. The coffee still brewed at the same strength, the newspapers still arrived with mechanical punctuality, the hallway still stretched from kitchen to front door in precisely the same dimensions. But something had altered in the spaces between these certainties, in the quality of silence that preceded the coffee maker's morning song. The footsteps weren't mine. That understanding came gradually, the way understanding often does when it concerns things we'd rather not know. They matched my rhythm almost perfectly, arriving just a heartbeat behind my own, creating an echo that felt too substantial for mere acoustics. The hallway's length seemed to accommodate this doubling, stretching just enough to make room for both sets of sounds. I began paying attention to the window then, noting its position each morning and evening. The latch showed no signs of tampering, the frame sat perfectly in its housing, yet the gap appeared with such regularity that I started to suspect my own memory. Perhaps I had always left it open. Perhaps the breeze had always carried that particular scent, something like rain on warm concrete, something like the inside of a closed car. The newspapers accumulated. Reading them felt like an intrusion into someone else's concerns, stories of distant troubles that had no bearing on the immediate mystery of the second mug, the persistent envelope, the window that opened itself to morning air. Headlines spoke of searches and discoveries, missing persons and unidentified remains, but these narratives belonged to other lives, other houses where coffee makers buzzed for different reasons. The neighbor had mentioned the lights during a chance encounter at the mailbox. A casual observation, delivered with the kind of friendly curiosity that expects no particular response. The lights had been on in the kitchen, they said, moving from window to window in a pattern that suggested someone preparing a meal or cleaning up afterward. This would have been unremarkable except that I had been visiting family across the state, sleeping in an unfamiliar bed, drinking coffee from borrowed mugs. I tried to reconstruct that evening, working backward from the neighbor's certainty. The house had been locked when I left, the coffee maker unplugged, the newspaper suspended. I had taken my keys, checked the doors twice, driven away with the particular satisfaction that comes from leaving a secure and empty home. Yet somewhere in those absent hours, lights had moved through my kitchen, casting familiar shadows, following patterns that suggested intimate knowledge of the space. The second mug appeared after that trip. I noticed it first as an anomaly, an extra piece of ceramic that didn't belong to my morning choreography. Its placement seemed intentional, positioned at the precise distance from the coffee maker that would make serving convenient for two people. The design matched my usual cup perfectly, suggesting it had been chosen with care, selected to blend seamlessly into the existing pattern. I left it there. Something about removing it felt like destroying evidence, though evidence of what remained unclear. The mug became part of the morning ritual, receiving its portion of coffee, steaming quietly while I stood in the kitchen trying to understand what had changed. The envelope arrived around this time too, sliding through the mail slot with the day's ordinary correspondence, distinguished only by its lack of identifying marks. The footsteps in the hallway grew more distinct, not louder but more present, as if their owner was gaining confidence or simply becoming less concerned with concealment. They followed no schedule I could discern, arriving sometimes in morning light, sometimes in the blue hours before dawn. Always they maintained that careful rhythm, that almost synchronization with my own movement that made them feel like an extension of my presence rather than an intrusion. I began testing the boundaries of this arrangement, moving through the house at unusual times, varying my route from kitchen to front door, pausing unexpectedly to see if the echo would adjust or falter. The response was always perfect, always precisely timed, as if my shadow had learned to make sound. The hallway accommodated these experiments without complaint, its length flexing subtly to maintain the proper acoustic spacing. The coffee maker's buzz became a kind of meditation. Its consistency provided an anchor point in mornings that had grown fluid, unpredictable in their small details. The newspapers might be stacked differently. The mail might include unexpected items. The window might be open or closed according to logic I couldn't follow. But the coffee maker maintained its reliable presence, counting out the minutes of brewing with mechanical devotion. I started leaving the second mug in different positions, curious to see if its placement would be corrected. Each morning brought subtle adjustments, never dramatic repositioning, never anything that couldn't be explained by forgetfulness or the natural settling of objects on uneven surfaces. But the mug migrated slowly toward its optimal position, guided by some intelligence that understood the kitchen's geometry better than random chance would allow. The envelope's persistence became almost comforting. In a world where small mysteries multiplied daily, its steady presence suggested that some questions could remain unresolved without consequence. The paper showed no signs of aging, the corners maintained their sharpness, the lack of return address continued to intrigue without alarming. It existed in its own category, neither urgent nor dismissible, requiring no action beyond acknowledgement. I thought about the neighbor's observation more frequently. The lights moving through my kitchen, following familiar patterns, suggested someone who knew the space intimately. Not a stranger exploring unfamiliar territory, but someone comfortable with the distances between counter and table, sink and coffee maker. Someone who understood which switches controlled which fixtures, who could navigate the room efficiently even in darkness. The possibility that I had somehow forgotten my own presence in the house seemed worth considering. Memory, I knew, could be unreliable, particularly around routine activities. Perhaps I had returned home briefly, made coffee, moved through the kitchen in my usual patterns, then forgotten the entire episode. The mind was capable of such omissions, particularly when stressed or preoccupied. But the second mug argued against this explanation. I had no memory of purchasing it, no recollection of deciding that my morning routine needed expansion. It had appeared as suddenly and completely as the footsteps in the hallway, as the envelope with no return address, as the window that opened itself to morning breezes. These elements formed a constellation of small impossibilities, too coordinated to be coincidental, too subtle to be alarming. The newspapers remained unread, their headlines growing stale while I focused on more immediate puzzles. Current events seemed less pressing than the question of who had been moving through my kitchen, why they had chosen to announce their presence so delicately, what they hoped to accomplish with this careful infiltration of my daily routine. The broader world could wait while I worked to understand the narrow mysteries of my own home. The hallway's length continued to fluctuate, accommodating the doubled footsteps with architectural flexibility that defied measurement. I tried pacing it off, counting steps from kitchen to front door, but the numbers varied depending on whether I walked alone or in the company of my echo. The house seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting to meet the needs of its occupants, however many there might be. The coffee maker's buzz took on conversational qualities. Its rhythm suggested patience, understanding, a willingness to wait while I worked through the implications of the second mug, the persistent envelope, the window that opened to let in breezes carrying scents I couldn't identify. The machine had become a confidant, the one constant in a domestic landscape that shifted according to rules I hadn't learned to read. I began to suspect that the changes had been gradual, accumulating over time until they reached a threshold of noticeability. Perhaps the window had been opening itself for months, the footsteps had been echoing for weeks, the second mug had been appearing and disappearing until I finally paid attention. The mind had ways of filtering out information that didn't fit established patterns, protecting consciousness from the exhausting work of constant vigilance. The envelope called to me more insistently now. Its unopened state had become an active choice rather than simple procrastination. Whatever it contained would either explain the recent changes or add another layer to the mystery, and I found myself reluctant to discover which. The unknown maintained possibilities that knowledge might foreclose, kept alive the hope that simple explanations existed for complex questions. The neighbor hadn't mentioned the lights again, but our encounters at the mailbox had grown more frequent, as if they too were curious about the developments in my domestic routine. Their observations came in fragments, casual mentions of sounds heard through shared walls, movements glimpsed through windows, the kinds of details that neighbors collect without quite meaning to. I listened carefully, trying to piece together an external view of my own life. The second mug had begun to feel necessary. Its presence balanced the morning ritual, created a symmetry that my solitary coffee drinking had lacked. I found myself filling it automatically, setting it in its preferred position, accepting its role in the daily choreography. The kitchen felt more complete with two mugs steaming quietly, more purposeful in its function as a space designed for multiple occupants. The footsteps had developed personality, not louder or more frequent, but more expressive, varying their rhythm in ways that suggested mood or intention. Sometimes they hurried to catch up with my pace, sometimes they lagged behind as if distracted by details I had missed. The hallway had become a stage for this daily performance, its length adjusting to accommodate the complex timing of our shared movement. The coffee maker's buzz grew more conversational, its mechanical voice offering commentary on the morning's small events. The sound had layers now, harmonics that spoke of age and faithful service, of countless mornings spent transforming water and grounds into the fuel of daily routine. I listened more carefully, hearing in its steady rhythm a kind of wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of a machine that had witnessed every variation of my domestic life. The window's position became a barometer of the house's mood. Open mornings felt expectant, charged with possibility, while closed mornings suggested introspection, a turning inward. The breeze that entered carried information I couldn't decode, scents and temperatures that spoke of distant events, other lives, other kitchens where coffee makers buzzed and windows opened to let in the morning air. I realized that the changes might not be ending, that the second mug and the echoing footsteps and the persistent envelope might be just the beginning of a longer transformation. The house was learning new patterns, accommodating new rhythms, expanding its definition of normal to include elements that would have seemed impossible before they became routine. I was both observer and participant in this evolution, watching my domestic life reshape itself around mysteries I couldn't solve. The newspapers yellowed in their neat stack, their urgency fading as the days accumulated. The headlines spoke of searches and discoveries, but the real mystery lived in my kitchen, in the hallway where footsteps doubled themselves, in the morning routine that had grown to include a second participant whose presence I felt but could not confirm. These local puzzles demanded more attention than distant crimes, required more careful investigation than the tragedies documented in newsprint. The envelope remained unopened, its secrets intact, its purpose unclear. It had become a talisman of uncertainty, a reminder that some questions could exist without answers, that mystery could coexist with daily life without destroying the possibility of routine. I walked past it each morning and evening, acknowledging its presence, accepting its role as keeper of unknown information. The coffee maker's buzz filled the kitchen again this morning, its familiar rhythm unchanged despite everything that had shifted around it. I reached for the second mug automatically, my hand knowing its location without conscious direction. The window stood ajar, admitting a breeze that carried that same unplaceable scent, that same suggestion of distant rain and warm concrete. The newspapers waited in their stack, the envelope maintained its patient presence, and the hallway stretched its accommodating length between kitchen and front door. The footsteps echoed just behind mine as I moved through the morning routine, their timing perfect, their presence as natural as my own shadow. I poured coffee into both mugs, set them in their proper positions, and stood in the kitchen listening to the coffee maker's mechanical song. The morning felt complete, balanced, exactly as it should be. It wasn't the first time the window was ajar, and I knew now it wouldn't be the last. The breeze carried in that same faint hint of something unplaceable, but I no longer paused to wonder what it might be. I had learned to accept the mystery, to find comfort in the questions that had no answers, to trust that some changes were meant to remain unexplained. The coffee maker buzzed quietly in the background, and I reached for both mugs, knowing that though only one was needed, I would always leave them both there. Story 2. I told them I'd only asked if she was okay. Just a quick check-in, I said, casual as passing time. Yet the words echoed on the walls, sinking into the chipped paint like whispers left behind. The air felt warm, unnaturally so, carrying a trace of something metallic and unwelcome. A chair sat slightly askew, its shadow longer than it should have been in the dim light. My pulse thudded against the silence, each beat an insistence of its own. Dust motes floated in the sunbeam, slicing through the window, marking the space where no one should have stood. But the curtain still swayed, an unanswered presence. The thing about memory is how it bends. I keep returning to that afternoon, the one where everything shifted without my permission. She had been sitting by the window, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass that left no mark. I watched from the doorway, uncertain whether to interrupt or retreat. The light caught her hair in a way that made her seem translucent, as if she might dissolve if I spoke too loudly. I remember thinking she looked fragile, not physically, but in some deeper way, like a thought that might scatter if examined too closely. Her breathing seemed deliberate, each inhale a decision she had to make. The room smelled of old coffee and something else I couldn't place, something that reminded me of rain on hot pavement. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded foreign in that space. "Are you okay?" I asked, though the words felt inadequate even as they left my mouth. She turned toward me, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe, or fear. The distinction blurs now, like watercolors bleeding into each other. But I'm getting ahead of myself, or perhaps behind. Time moves strangely in this telling, circling back on itself like a record with a scratch. The investigation began before I knew there was anything to investigate. It started with small things, inconsistencies that nagged at the edges of my awareness. Her coffee cup, for instance. She always left it in the same spot on the kitchen counter, a white ceramic thing with a chip on the handle. But one morning I found it in the sink, washed and dried, sitting upside down on the dish rack. When I mentioned it, she looked at me as if I had spoken in a language she didn't recognize. "I didn't wash any dishes," she said. Her voice carried a certainty that made me doubt my own observation, but I knew what I had seen. The cup had been there, clean and foreign in its wrongness. These moments accumulated like sediment, building layers of unease I couldn't name. The way she would pause mid-sentence, her eyes focusing on something just over my shoulder. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when she claimed to be reading in bed. The phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. I began to catalog these incidents, not consciously at first, but with the instinctive attention of someone who senses a pattern forming. A notebook appeared on my desk, filled with observations I didn't remember writing. Her schedule mapped out in my careful handwriting. The names of people she mentioned, cross-referenced with the times she claimed to be alone. The detectives would later ask about this notebook, their questions wrapped in the kind of professional neutrality that barely concealed suspicion. They wanted to know when I had started keeping track and why, as if surveillance were something that began with a decision rather than growing slowly, like mold in a damp corner. I tried to explain that it wasn't surveillance, not really. It was more like translation, an attempt to decode a language that had become increasingly foreign. She would say she was going to the store, and I would find grocery receipts dated from the previous week. She would mention a conversation with her sister, but when I called to check on something unrelated, her sister would mention not having spoken to her in months. The lies weren't malicious, I don't think. They felt more like protective coloring, a way of blending into a reality that made more sense than the one we were actually inhabiting. But they created gaps, spaces where doubt could take root and flourish. I remember the first time I followed her. It wasn't planned, not exactly. I had been driving home from work when I saw her car at a traffic light, heading in the opposite direction from where she had said she would be. Something compelled me to turn around, to maintain a careful distance as she navigated streets I didn't recognize. She parked outside a building I had never seen before, a nondescript structure with tinted windows and no visible signage. I watched from across the street as she sat in her car for several minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel. When she finally got out, her movements seemed different, more purposeful than the hesitant way she moved at home. I waited for her to return, engine running, radio playing softly to mask the sound of my breathing. The building revealed nothing, its windows reflecting only sky and passing clouds. When she emerged an hour later, she looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that made my chest tighten with something that might have been guilt or fear. That evening she mentioned stopping by the library, showed me a book she claimed to have checked out. The The story was plausible, carefully constructed, but it sat wrong in the space between us. I nodded and smiled, playing my part in whatever performance we had stumbled into. The notebook grew thicker, addresses, license plate numbers, fragments of overheard phone conversations. I told myself I was trying to understand, to bridge the growing distance between us. But understanding requires honesty, and we had both become strangers to that particular virtue. The breakthrough, if you could call it that, came through a photograph. I found it tucked inside a book she had left on the coffee table, a picture of her standing next to someone I didn't recognize. They were smiling, arms linked in the casual intimacy of people who shared secrets. The background was unfamiliar, a restaurant or cafe with distinctive tilework that I thought I might be able to trace. But when I looked for the photograph again, it was gone. The book remained, but its pages yielded nothing except the faint impression of something that might have been there once. I began to question my own memory, to wonder if the image had been real or simply another trick of a mind under pressure. The police interview room was smaller than I had expected, painted in a shade of green that reminded me of hospitals. The detective across from me had kind eyes and a voice that suggested we were having a friendly conversation rather than something more formal. She asked about the last time I had seen her, about our relationship, about whether I had noticed any changes in her behavior. I told them about the coffee cup, about the photograph, about the building with tinted windows. My words sounded thin in that sterile space, like smoke dissipating in still air. The detective took notes, her pen scratching against the paper with mechanical precision. Had there been any arguments, she wanted to know, any signs of distress or unusual behavior. I struggled to explain that everything had been unusual, that normal had become a foreign concept in our shared life. But how do you describe the absence of something you can't quite name? They released me after several hours, with instructions not to leave town and a business card I was supposed to call if I remembered anything else. I drove home through streets that looked different in the afternoon light, as if the morning's events had somehow altered their fundamental geometry. The house felt larger without her presence, rooms echoing with the memory of conversations that now seemed to carry hidden meanings. I found myself retracing her movements, sitting in the chair by the window where she used to watch the street, trying to see whatever had captured her attention. The investigation continued around me, a machine I was both part of and separate from. Detectives came and went, asking variations of the same questions, searching for inconsistencies in my answers. I learned to speak carefully, to weigh each word before releasing it into the space between us. But alone in the house, I continued my own investigation, driven by a need that felt more like hunger than curiosity. I searched through her belongings, looking for clues to a mystery I couldn't fully articulate. Her clothes still smelled like her perfume, a scent that now seemed to carry undertones of deception. I found a receipt in her coat pocket, dated from the day she claimed to have been visiting her mother. The purchase was small, insignificant, a bottle of water and a candy bar from a convenience store 50 miles away. But it was proof, tangible evidence that the careful architecture of her explanations had been built on unstable ground. The receipt joined the notebook, which had grown into multiple notebooks, a catalog of discrepancies that painted a picture I was afraid to examine too closely. Each entry was a small betrayal, a moment where the person I thought I knew had revealed herself to be someone else entirely. But betrayal implies intent, and I was never certain that was what this was. Her lies seemed more like self-defense, a way of protecting something fragile from scrutiny it might not survive. I began to wonder if the person I had been living with was as much a mystery to herself as she had become to me. The phone call came on a morning when the light looked different, sharper somehow, cutting through the kitchen window with unusual clarity. Her voice was distant, muffled by static and what sounded like wind. She was safe, she said, but couldn't come home yet. There were things she needed to work out, decisions that required solitude. I asked where she was, but the connection was poor, her words fragmenting into syllables that might have been place names or simply the sound of interference. Before I could ask anything else, the line went dead, leaving me holding a phone that buzzed with dial tone. The detectives were skeptical when I reported the call. They asked technical questions about caller ID and call duration, details I hadn't thought to note. Their doubt was palpable, a weight that settled in the room between us. I began to wonder if they suspected me of more than just withholding information. But the call had been real as anything else in this shifting landscape of partial truths and careful omissions. Her voice had carried something I recognized, a quality that spoke of decisions made in darkness, of choosing an uncertain future over a known past. I stopped keeping the notebooks after that. The accumulation of small mysteries seemed less important than the larger question of what drove someone to disappear from their own life. I began to understand that some investigations lead not to answers, but to better questions, and that truth is sometimes less important than the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of chaos. The house grew quiet in a way that felt permanent. I learned to move through its rooms without disturbing the careful arrangement of objects she had left behind, as if her absence were a presence that required its own space. The coffee cup remained in the cupboard, its chipped handle a reminder of the morning when I first noticed that nothing was quite what it seemed. Sometimes I found myself standing by the window where she used to sit, watching the street with the same intensity she had shown. I wondered what she had been looking for, whether she had found it, whether her disappearance was an ending or simply a different kind of beginning. The investigation officially ended without resolution, filed away in some bureaucratic limbo where unsolved cases wait for new evidence or fresh perspectives. The detectives moved on to other mysteries, other families disrupted by the sudden absence of someone they thought they knew. But I remained in the space between questions and answers, learning to live with uncertainty as if it were another resident in the house. The photograph I thought I had seen became a metaphor for all the evidence that existed just beyond the reach of confirmation, real enough to influence but too ephemeral to prove. I told them I'd only asked if she was okay, and in the end that became the most honest thing I could say. The question echoed in the empty rooms, bouncing off walls that had absorbed too many careful conversations and unspoken doubts. The air still carried traces of something I couldn't name, warm and metallic, like the aftermath of decisions that change everything while seeming to change nothing at all. The chair by the window remained slightly askew, its shadow falling across the floor in patterns that shifted with the light. And sometimes, when the afternoon sun cut through the glass just right, dust motes would dance in the beam, marking spaces where presence and absence blurred into something that might have been understanding, if understanding were something that could be held without dissolving in the warmth of examination. Story 3. It sounded like an old door slowly swinging open, the kind you might find in an attic or a cellar, places meant to keep secrets tucked away. I stood in the kitchen where the hum of the fridge was the only expected sound, yet there it was again, a groan of metal and wood threading through the air like a whisper. I turned toward the hallway, compelled by a need to locate its source, though deep down I knew no door was open. Each step felt measured, as if daring the past to catch up. The image of a dust-covered attic flashed in the corners of my mind, taunting me with something I hadn't thought of in years. I shouldn't have been able to hear it here, but I did. The hallway stretched before me, lined with photographs that seemed to watch my approach. Family portraits hung at perfect intervals, their subjects smiling with practiced warmth, but their eyes felt different now, as though they were studying me rather than simply existing as decorative memories. The sound had stopped, leaving only the whisper of my bare feet against the hardwood floor. I paused at the base of the staircase, my hand resting on the banister's smooth surface. The wood felt cooler than it should have, almost damp, though no moisture was visible. Above me, the second floor remained cloaked in shadow despite the afternoon light filtering through the windows below. Something about the darkness up there felt deliberate, as if it were hiding rather than simply existing. The detective had asked me to walk through the house again to see if anything felt different or out of place. She'd spoken in that careful tone investigators use when they suspect you know more than you're admitting. Her questions had been gentle but persistent, circling around the same themes like water finding its way down a drain. Where was I when it happened? Did I hear anything unusual? Had there been any recent changes in behavior, any signs of distress? I'd answered honestly, or at least I believed I had. Memory has a way of reshaping itself, smoothing rough edges and filling in gaps with assumptions that feel like facts. But standing here now, listening to the house breathe around me, I wondered if honesty was even possible when the truth felt so slippery. The living room drew my attention next. Everything appeared exactly as it had been left, yet something felt wrong. The cushions on the sofa were arranged just so, the coffee table cleared of any clutter, magazines stacked with military precision. It was too perfect, too carefully composed, like a stage set waiting for actors to bring it to life. I moved closer to the mantelpiece, where framed photographs created a timeline of happier moments. Beach vacations, birthday celebrations, graduation ceremonies, all the expected milestones of a life well documented. But there was a gap in the arrangement, a slightly wider space between two frames that suggested something had been removed. The dust pattern on the wood confirmed my suspicion, a clean rectangle surrounded by a thin layer of neglect. What photograph had been taken away and why? The detective hadn't mentioned removing anything, and I couldn't recall doing it myself. Yet the evidence was undeniable, staring back at me with the persistence of an unanswered question. The kitchen called me back, perhaps because it was where I'd first heard that impossible sound. I opened the refrigerator, not from hunger but from a need to do something normal, something that would anchor me to the present moment. The shelves were well stocked but strangely impersonal. Condiments lined up like soldiers, leftovers sealed in identical containers, everything labeled with dates written in unfamiliar handwriting. I picked up one of the containers, studying the careful script on its lid. The writing was neat, methodical, nothing like the hurried scrawl I usually managed when marking food for storage. Had someone else been organizing the kitchen? The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the open refrigerator. Closing the door, I leaned against the counter and tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that had brought the police to my doorstep. The phone call had come while I was at work, the voice on the other end professional but urgent. There had been an incident, they said. I needed to come home immediately. The drive had passed in a blur of traffic lights and racing thoughts, each possibility more terrible than the last. But when I arrived, the house had been quiet, too quiet. Officers moved through the rooms with careful efficiency, their voices low and respectful. They'd asked me to wait outside while they completed their initial assessment, leaving me to stand on the sidewalk like a stranger observing someone else's tragedy. The detective had been kind but thorough, her questions probing gently into corners I hadn't known existed. She'd taken notes in a small leather notebook, her pen moving steadily across the pages as I struggled to provide answers that felt increasingly inadequate. How do you explain the absence of something you can't quite identify? How do you describe a wrongness that exists more in feeling than in fact? Now alone in the house again, I found myself retracing those conversations, searching for clues in my own words. Had I said something that revealed more than I intended? Had my responses painted a picture I didn't recognize? The basement door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been closed when I left that morning. The detective and her team had searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They'd been thorough, professional, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. A few fingerprint powder smudges, some disturbed dust patterns, the lingering scent of official business conducted in private spaces. I approached the basement door with reluctance, my hand hovering over the switch that would flood the stairs with light. The darkness below seemed thick, almost tangible, as if it were something I could reach out and touch. When I finally flipped the switch, the bulb cast harsh shadows that made familiar objects look foreign and menacing. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, yet somehow different. Storage boxes lined the walls, their contents labeled in that same careful handwriting I'd noticed in the kitchen. Christmas decorations, old books, seasonal clothing, the detritus of a life lived in accumulation, each box a chapter in a story I was only beginning to question. One box sat slightly apart from the others, its lid askew as though it had been hastily closed. I approached it with the same caution I might show a sleeping animal, uncertain whether my presence would wake something better left undisturbed. Inside, I found photographs, hundreds of them, loose and unorganized, spanning years of captured moments. These weren't the carefully curated images displayed upstairs. These were the outtakes, the imperfect shots, the candid moments caught between poses. Faces I recognized but couldn't quite place, locations that seemed familiar yet strange, and in many of them I saw myself but not as I remembered being. The expressions were wrong somehow, the body language foreign, as if I were looking at someone who merely resembled me. One photograph in particular caught my attention. It showed me standing in this very basement, but the scene was different. The boxes were arranged differently, the walls were a different color, and my face wore an expression I'd never seen in a mirror. When had this been taken? Who had been behind the camera? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each answer spawning 3 new mysteries. I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened, trying to determine if the sounds were real or another auditory phantom like the creaking door. The footsteps paused, resumed, paused again, as if whoever was walking was searching for something or someone. Clutching the photograph, I climbed the stairs with careful quiet, each step a negotiation between curiosity and fear. The main floor was empty, exactly as I'd left it, but the air felt different, warmer somehow, as if it had recently been stirred by movement. A faint scent lingered, something floral and familiar, but I couldn't identify its source. The detective had given me her card, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if anything unusual occurred. I pulled the card from my pocket, studying her name and number as if they might provide some clarity. But what would I tell her? That I'd heard footsteps in an empty house, that photographs existed of moments I couldn't remember, that my own kitchen felt like it belonged to someone else. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a blade. I stared at it for several rings before finding the courage to answer, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. The caller was a neighbor offering condolences and asking if there was anything they could do to help. Their words washed over me without quite registering, a stream of kindness that felt simultaneously genuine and hollow. I heard myself responding appropriately, thanking them for their concern, assuring them I was managing as well as could be expected. But as the conversation continued, I realized I didn't know what I was supposed to be managing. What exactly had happened in this house? What tragedy had brought the police to my door and neighbors to my phone? The detective had spoken as if I knew, as if the facts were established and we were simply discussing details. But the central event remained frustratingly vague, like trying to remember a dream that dissolves the moment you reach for it. After hanging up, I returned to the living room, drawn again to that gap on the mantelpiece. I studied the remaining photographs more carefully, looking for clues about what might have been removed. The images showed a progression of relationships and celebrations, but there was a subtle wrongness to the chronology. Faces appeared and disappeared without explanation. Backgrounds shifted in ways that suggested more than simple relocation. In one photograph, I stood next to someone whose arm was visible but whose body had been carefully cropped out of the frame. In another, a shadow fell across the scene in a way that suggested a third person present, someone the camera had failed to capture or someone who had been deliberately excluded from the final image. I found myself studying my own face in these pictures, searching for signs of the person I believed myself to be. But the more I looked, the more foreign I became to myself. Was that really how I smiled? Did I always hold my shoulders at that angle? When had I started looking so tired, so guarded? The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows through the windows. I moved through the house, turning on lights, not because I needed them, but because the growing darkness felt oppressive. Each illuminated room revealed the same careful arrangement, the same sense of a life paused mid-sentence. In the bedroom, I discovered more evidence of that meticulous organization. Clothes hung in the closet with mathematical precision, sorted by color and season. The dresser drawers contained undergarments folded with the care of a professional retailer. Even the medicine cabinet in the attached bathroom showed signs of recent reorganization, bottles arranged by height and frequency of use. None of this matched my usual habits. I was neat enough, but not obsessive, certainly not to this degree. Yet the organization was too extensive to have been accomplished quickly. This represented weeks or months of gradual improvement, a slow transformation I couldn't remember participating in. I sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph from the basement still in my hand. The image seemed to shift in the changing light, revealing details I hadn't noticed before. Behind my figure in the picture, barely visible in the shadows, was the suggestion of another person. Not clearly defined, more of an impression than a presence, but undeniably there. Who had been with me in that basement? When had the photograph been taken? And why couldn't I remember any of it? The detective's questions began to take on new significance. She'd asked about recent changes in behavior, about signs of distress. At the time, I'd interpreted these as standard inquiries, the kind of questions investigators ask when trying to establish a timeline. But now I wondered if she'd been probing for something specific, some knowledge she possessed that I lacked. The house settled around me with the familiar sounds of cooling wood and shifting foundations. But underneath these normal noises, I thought I could hear something else. Not the creaking door that had started this strange day, but something more subtle. The whisper of movement in rooms I wasn't occupying, the suggestion of presence in spaces I believed to be empty. I returned to the kitchen, drawn by a need for something normal and grounding, but even here the wrongness persisted. The refrigerator hummed its steady song, but the rhythm seemed off somehow, as if it were struggling with some internal malfunction. I opened it again, studying the contents with new attention. The food was fresh, recently purchased, but I couldn't remember shopping for any of it. The milk hadn't passed its expiration date, the vegetables showed no signs of age, the leftovers were labeled with dates from the current week. Yet I had no memory of preparing meals, no recollection of the routine activities that would have filled these containers. How many days had passed since I'd last felt truly present in my own life? How long had I been moving through familiar motions without conscious participation? The questions circled through my mind like water going down a drain, each revolution taking me deeper into uncertainty. The basement called to me again, that box of photographs promising answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find, but as I reached for the door handle, I heard it again. The sound of an old door slowly swinging open, that groan of metal and wood that had started everything. This time, though, it seemed to be coming from upstairs. I climbed the stairs with my heart racing, following the sound to its source. The hallway above was dark, the shadows deeper than they should have been, but at the far end I could see a door standing slightly ajar, a door I was certain had been closed. As I approached, the floral scent grew stronger, mixed now with something else. Something that reminded me of dust and old paper, of spaces long closed and recently opened. The door led to a room I rarely entered, a spare bedroom that served mainly as storage for items too important to discard, but too rarely used to keep accessible. The room was different, not dramatically, but in small ways that accumulated into something significant. The bed was made with hospital corners, the surface so smooth it looked untouched by human hands. The dresser had been cleared of its usual clutter, leaving only a small jewelry box and a framed photograph I didn't recognize. I picked up the photograph, studying the faces within. There was a celebration of some kind, people gathered around a table laden with food and flowers. I recognized some of the faces, including my own, but the context was completely foreign. When had this been taken? Who were these people? Why did I look so happy in a moment I couldn't remember experiencing? Behind me, the door swung closed with a soft click. I turned to find myself alone in the room, the photograph still in my hands, the silence pressing against my ears like deep water. The jewelry box on the dresser caught the light from the window, its surface reflecting fragments of the room back at me in miniature. Inside the box, I found items that should have been familiar but felt like artifacts from someone else's life. A watch I didn't remember owning, earrings that weren't my style, a ring that didn't fit my finger. Each piece was carefully arranged in its own compartment, as if they were precious relics rather than everyday accessories. At the bottom of the box, underneath the jewelry, I found a key. It was small and brass, old-fashioned in design, the kind that might open a diary or a small chest. I held it up to the light, studying its worn edges and tarnished surface. Somewhere in this house, there was a lock this key was meant to open, but where? The search took me back through every room, every drawer, every possible hiding place. I looked behind furniture, inside closets, under beds. The key felt warm in my palm, as if it were alive and eager to fulfill its purpose. But its lock remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the geography of my own home. It was only when I returned to the basement that I noticed the small chest tucked behind the water heater. It was wooden, about the size of a shoebox, with brass fittings that matched the key perfectly. My hands trembled as I inserted the key and turned it, the mechanism clicking open with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. Inside I found letters, dozens of them, written in that same careful handwriting I'd noticed throughout the house. They were addressed to me, but in a tone and style that suggested an intimacy I couldn't place. The writer spoke of shared memories, private jokes, future plans. They referenced conversations I couldn't remember having and experiences I was certain I'd never lived. One letter in particular caught my attention. It was more recent than the others, dated just days ago. The tone was different, more urgent, tinged with worry and frustration. The writer expressed concern about my behavior, my increasing forgetfulness, my tendency to deny experiences we'd shared. They pleaded with me to remember, to acknowledge what we meant to each other. The letter was signed with initials I didn't recognize, written in a hand that was becoming disturbingly familiar. This person had been in my house, organizing my belongings, preparing my meals, living a life that intersected with mine in ways I couldn't recall or understand. I sat on the basement floor, surrounded by evidence of a relationship I couldn't remember, reading letters that described a version of myself I didn't recognize. The person in these pages was passionate, engaged, deeply connected to someone whose very existence had been erased from my conscious memory. But as I read, fragments began to surface. Not complete memories, but impressions, sensations, the ghost of familiarity that suggested these experiences might be real. The scent of that particular perfume, the sound of laughter in the kitchen, the feeling of not being alone in a house that now felt empty. The detective's questions took on new meaning in this context. She hadn't been asking about recent changes in behavior out of routine curiosity. She'd been probing for signs of something specific, some knowledge that would explain what had happened here. But what exactly had occurred? Where was the person who had written these letters, and why couldn't I remember them? I climbed the stairs again, the letters clutched in my hand, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. The house felt different now, charged with the presence of someone who should have been there but wasn't. Every room held traces of a life I'd forgotten, evidence of connections I'd somehow severed from my conscious mind. The photograph from the mantelpiece, the one that had been removed, suddenly made sense. It had shown the two of us together, proof of the relationship documented in these letters. Someone had taken it away, but whether that someone was me or the letter writer or some third party remained unclear. I found myself standing in the kitchen again, where this strange journey had begun with the sound of an impossible door. But now the impossibility felt different. Perhaps the door I'd heard wasn't a physical one at all, but something metaphorical. The sound of memory trying to open, of buried truth attempting to surface, of a past I'd locked away fighting to be acknowledged. The refrigerator hummed its steady rhythm, and I realized the sound had never been wrong. I had been wrong, my perception altered by the absence of something I couldn't name. The house wasn't too quiet. It was missing the sounds of two people living together, the comfortable noise of shared existence. As darkness settled over the house, I sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread before me. Each one was a piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. They painted a picture of love and loss, of memory and forgetting, of a truth so painful that my mind had chosen to bury it rather than face it directly. But burial isn't the same as erasure. The evidence remained, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The careful organization of my belongings, the unfamiliar handwriting, the photographs of moments I couldn't recall. All of it pointed to a presence that had been central to my life and was now conspicuously absent. The detective would return, I was certain of that. She would have more questions, more gentle probing into the corners of my fractured memory, and perhaps with these letters as evidence, I would be able to provide the answers she was looking for. Or perhaps the answers would only lead to more questions, deeper mysteries, truths too complex for simple resolution. The sound of the old door came again, but this time I understood it differently. It wasn't the groan of hinges or the protest of warped wood. It was the sound of my own mind, slowly opening to possibilities I'd refused to consider. The past was calling, demanding acknowledgement, insisting on its right to exist in the present moment. I gathered the letters carefully, returning them to their chest, locking away the evidence of a love I couldn't remember but was beginning to feel. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new investigations, new attempts to reconstruct a truth that felt as fragile as morning mist. But tonight I would sit in this house that was both familiar and strange, listening to the sounds of absence, waiting for memory to decide whether it wanted to return or remain forever locked behind doors I might never find the courage to open. Story 4. The morning sun crept through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The scent of fresh paint lingered in the air, yet the room felt abandoned as though it had been untouched for years. A single chair stood in the center, perfectly aligned with the faded wallpaper's intricate pattern. Everything was silent, almost too quiet, except for a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from nowhere, yet resonated with an unsettling familiarity. I knew exactly what had happened in that room. The case was straightforward, really. A woman had vanished from her apartment, leaving behind only this peculiar scene. The landlord had found her gone after she'd missed rent payments for 3 consecutive months. The police had already closed the file, marking it as a voluntary disappearance. Adults have the right to leave their lives behind, they'd explained to her worried sister. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just an empty apartment with fresh paint and a chair positioned in the exact center of the room. I'd been hired by the sister to confirm what everyone already suspected. The missing woman had suffered from severe depression, had spoken about wanting to start over somewhere new. The fresh paint suggested she'd been preparing to leave, maybe trying to get her security deposit back. The centered chair was probably just where the painters had left it. Simple explanations for simple facts. The rhythmic tapping was likely the old radiator pipes settling in the morning heat. These older buildings always had their quirks, their sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. I'd heard similar noises in dozens of apartments just like this one. Nothing mysterious about it. But as I stood there that first morning, notebook in hand, something felt wrong about my neat conclusions. The paint smell was too strong for a room that appeared untouched for months. I walked to the nearest wall and pressed my palm against it. The surface was completely dry, but the scent hit me like a wave. How could paint smell so fresh after all this time? I examined the chair more closely. Its legs had created perfect indentations in the wooden floor, as if it had been sitting in that exact spot for years, not moved there temporarily by painters. The wood around the chair legs was darker, protected from sunlight and wear. This chair had been positioned here long before any painting began. The tapping continued, soft but insistent. I followed the sound around the room, pressing my ear to different walls, checking the radiator, examining the windows. The rhythm never changed, never stopped, but I couldn't locate its source. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. I called the landlord that afternoon. He was a nervous man with sweaty palms who kept glancing at the chair as we spoke. When I asked about the painting, he hesitated before answering. The missing woman had requested the work herself, he said. She'd insisted on doing it alone, wouldn't let him hire professionals. She'd bought the paint and brushes herself, worked on it for days. But when I asked which walls she'd painted, he couldn't give me a straight answer. He gestured vaguely around the room, muttering about how she'd been very particular about the color. When I pressed him for details about the color itself, he fell silent. Looking around the room now, I realized I couldn't determine what color the walls actually were. They seemed to shift in the changing light, appearing white in some moments, cream in others, sometimes taking on an almost gray tinge. The sister arrived the next morning while I was taking photographs. She was a small woman with darting eyes who spoke in whispers, as if afraid someone might overhear. She kept staring at the chair, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the room. She told me her sister had called her just days before disappearing. During that conversation, she'd mentioned the chair specifically. She'd said it was the only piece of furniture that felt right in the room, the only thing that belonged. She talked about sitting in it for hours, listening to the sounds the building made, learning its rhythms. According to the sister, the missing woman had developed an obsession with the apartment's history. She'd spent weeks researching previous tenants, tracking down former neighbors, collecting stories about who had lived in the space before her. She'd become convinced that the room held memories, that it was trying to communicate something important. But as the sister spoke, her story began to shift. First, she said her sister had lived in the apartment for 2 years. Then she corrected herself and said it was 3. When I asked about the research into previous tenants, she looked confused, as if she couldn't remember mentioning it. She kept glancing at the chair, her expression growing more troubled with each look. I started visiting the apartment every morning, always at the same time, always when the sun created those long shadows across the floor. The tapping became a constant companion, a rhythm I found myself unconsciously matching with my breathing. I began to understand why someone might want to sit in that chair for hours, listening. The neighbors I interviewed gave conflicting accounts of the missing woman. Some described her as quiet and withdrawn, others as friendly and outgoing. One elderly man insisted she'd been tall with dark hair, while a woman from the same floor swore she was short and blonde. When I showed them the photograph the sister had provided, they looked uncertain, as if they couldn't quite match the image to their memories. The building's maintenance records revealed something troubling. The apartment had been vacant for 6 months before the missing woman moved in. But according to several neighbors, someone had been living there during that time. They'd heard footsteps, seen lights in the windows, occasionally encountered a woman in the hallways who fit the missing woman's description. I found myself returning to the apartment at different times of day, trying to understand how the light changed the room's character. In the afternoons, the shadows fell differently, making the chair appear to shift position slightly. The tapping grew more pronounced in the evenings, developing subtle variations in rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. The paint smell never faded. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger during my visits, as if the walls were continuously refreshing themselves. I began to wonder if someone was still coming to the apartment, still working on some endless painting project. But the landlord insisted he was the only one with keys, and he swore he hadn't been back since showing me the space. During one late afternoon visit, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The chair's position had changed, not dramatically, but enough that the shadows fell differently across its seat. The indentations in the floor remained in their original spots, but the chair itself had moved several inches forward. I confronted the landlord about other people having access to the apartment. His nervous demeanor intensified, and he began contradicting himself. First, he insisted the locks hadn't been changed since the missing woman left. Then he mentioned having them rekeyed for security. When I asked who else might have copies, he claimed not to remember, then suggested maybe the previous tenant had never returned theirs. But according to his earlier statements, the apartment had been vacant before the missing woman moved in. When I pointed out this inconsistency, he stared at me blankly, as if he couldn't understand what I was saying. He kept wiping his palms on his pants, leaving damp streaks on the fabric. The sister's behavior grew increasingly erratic during our subsequent meetings. She'd call me at odd hours, whispering urgent messages about things she'd remembered, then seem confused when I called her back. She began insisting that her sister was still alive, still in the apartment somehow, still sitting in that chair and listening to the building's secrets. When I suggested we contact the police about reopening the case, she became agitated. She claimed the authorities couldn't be trusted, that they were part of some larger conspiracy to keep the truth hidden. But when I asked what truth she meant, she couldn't explain. She'd just stare at me with those darting eyes, as if expecting me to understand something she couldn't put into words. I started having dreams about the apartment. In these dreams, I was sitting in the chair, feeling the worn fabric beneath my hands, listening to that rhythmic tapping as it grew louder and more complex. Sometimes I would wake up with the distinct sensation that I had actually been there, that the dreams were memories of visits I couldn't quite recall making. The building manager, when I finally tracked her down, told a different story entirely. According to her records, the missing woman had never officially rented the apartment. The lease was in someone else's name, someone who had disappeared months earlier. But the signature on the lease documents looked identical to the handwriting samples the sister had provided. I began to suspect that the sister knew more than she was telling me. Her stories about phone calls and conversations with the missing woman became increasingly elaborate and contradictory. She described detailed discussions about the apartment's history, then claimed her sister had never mentioned the place at all. She'd insist they'd spoken recently, then break down crying about how much she missed her. But my suspicions about the sister led to darker questions about my own role in this mystery. Why had she specifically chosen me to investigate? How had she known to find me? When I tried to recall our first meeting, the details seemed fuzzy, as if I were trying to remember something that had happened to someone else. I realized I couldn't remember cashing her check or depositing any payment for my services. When I searched through my files, I found no contract, no formal agreement to take the case. Yet I'd been working on it for weeks, visiting the apartment daily, interviewing neighbors and building staff. What had motivated me to invest so much time in a case I apparently wasn't being paid for? The apartment began to feel familiar in ways that unsettled me. I knew which floorboard would creak when I stepped on it, which window provided the best view of the courtyard below. I found myself anticipating the changes in light throughout the day, knowing exactly when the shadows would reach the chair, when the tapping would grow most pronounced. Standing in that room now, I can't shake the feeling that I've become part of whatever happened here. The boundaries between investigator and subject have blurred beyond recognition. I no longer know if I'm searching for a missing woman or if someone is searching for me. The chair sits in its center position, patient and waiting, while the rhythmic tapping continues its endless message. The fresh paint smell surrounds me like a cocoon, and I understand now that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be experienced, to be lived within until the distinction between truth and fiction becomes meaningless. The morning sun still creeps through those thin curtains, casting the same long shadows it has always cast, and I find myself wondering if I'll ever leave this room, or if I've already become another story for the next investigator to unravel. Story 5. The door stayed open without a whisper. My fingers brushed the edge, bracing for the familiar resistance, but the wood remained unnaturally yielding. As I stepped inside, the floor lacked its usual protest, offering no creak to betray my presence. I paused, expecting the soft hum of the refrigerator to greet me, but the air was stilled, thick with expectation. My gaze drifted to the coat hooked by the entrance, a shadow of a jacket lingering in its absence. The space seemed to breathe around me, shaping the silence into something almost tangible, as if the room itself was waiting for what's never meant to return. The nausea starts in my chest, not my stomach. It spreads upward like smoke, filling the hollow spaces behind my ribs until breathing becomes a conscious effort. I've been carrying this weight for weeks now, maybe months. Time has become fluid, unreliable. The feeling sits heavy in my throat, metallic and persistent, like I've been swallowing coins. I remember standing in this same doorway before, but the memory feels borrowed, as if it belongs to someone else. The coat hook held something then, a blue windbreaker with a torn pocket, the kind of detail that should matter but doesn't, except it does. The fabric was synthetic, the kind that makes noise when you move, but there was no sound that day either. My hands shake when I think about it. Not a tremor, but a deep vibration that starts in my bones and works its way outward. I press my palms against my thighs, feeling the denim rough under my skin. The texture grounds me, pulls me back to this moment, this room, this silence that feels like waiting. The kitchen table sits exactly where it always has, but the chairs are wrong. One is pushed back at an angle that suggests interrupted conversation. The other is tucked neatly under the table's edge. I can't remember which chair I sat in that day. I can't remember if I sat at all. There was coffee. The smell of it still haunts the corners of this room, though the pot sits clean and empty on the counter. French roast, bitter and strong, the kind that stains your teeth and makes your heart race. I can taste it now, phantom flavor coating my tongue with its familiar burn. But I don't drink coffee anymore, haven't since that day. The day that might not have happened the way I remember it. Memory is a liar. It edits and revises, smooths rough edges, and fills in gaps with convenient fiction. I know this, have always known this, but the knowledge doesn't help. The memories come anyway, uninvited and insistent, painting pictures that feel more real than the room I'm standing in now. I see hands reaching for the coffee pot, not my hands, smaller, with short nails and a silver ring on the middle finger. The ring caught the light from the window, threw tiny rainbows across the white ceramic mug. Such a beautiful detail. Such a specific, beautiful detail that my mind must have invented because beauty has no place in what happened next. But what did happen next? The question loops in my head like a broken record, wearing grooves in my thoughts until everything else becomes background noise. I've asked myself this question so many times that the words have lost meaning, become sounds without substance. What happened next? What happened next? What happened next? The refrigerator hums to life suddenly, making me jump. The sound is wrong, too loud in the persistent quiet. It reminds me of breathing, of the way air sounds when it's forced through reluctant lungs. I want to unplug it, to restore the silence, but I can't move. My feet have grown roots into the worn linoleum. There was a conversation, I'm sure of this, though I can't remember the words. Voices rising and falling like waves, carrying meaning I couldn't quite grasp. Important words, dangerous words, words that changed everything and nothing. The kitchen absorbed them, held them in its walls like secrets. I was angry, the emotion surfaces without context, pure and clean and terrible. Anger that tasted like copper pennies and felt like fire in my chest. But anger at what? At whom? The feeling exists without object, without reason, floating free in the space between memory and imagination. The window above the sink frames a view I've seen thousands of times, but today it looks like a photograph, flat and lifeless. The glass is clean, too clean. Someone washed it recently. Someone scrubbed away the fingerprints and water spots, erased the evidence of ordinary living. The gesture feels significant, though I can't say why. I approach the window, each step deliberate and heavy. My reflection appears gradually in the glass, superimposed over the view beyond. My face looks wrong, like a mask that doesn't quite fit. The eyes are mine, but not mine, holding knowledge I don't remember acquiring. When did I learn to look at myself with such suspicion? The sink is spotless, the chrome faucet gleaming, but I remember it differently. I remember stains, coffee rings on the white porcelain, dishes piled carelessly in the basin. The cleanliness feels like an accusation, like evidence of guilt I can't name. Water runs when I turn the handle, clear and cold against my palms. I cup my hands, bring the water to my face, let it run down my cheeks like tears I haven't cried. The cold shocks me back into my body, reminds me that I'm real, that this moment is happening now, not then. But when was then? The calendar on the wall shows a month I don't recognize. The days are marked with appointments I didn't make, events I didn't plan, my handwriting but not my words, my pen but not my thoughts. Someone has been living my life while I've been away, filling in the gaps I left behind. I tear the calendar from the wall, the paper making a satisfying ripping sound. Underneath, the paint is darker, a perfect rectangle of color protected from the sun's bleaching touch. How long has this calendar hung here? How long have I been gone? The torn paper crumples in my fist, months and days and appointments becoming meaningless pulp. I should throw it away, but instead I smooth it out on the counter, trying to read the appointments through the wrinkles. Doctor visits, grocery lists, reminders to call people whose names I don't recognize. A life documented in careful handwriting, none of it mine. The nausea returns, stronger now, accompanied by dizziness that makes the room tilt and sway. I grip the counter's edge, knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. The kitchen breathes around me, walls expanding and contracting like lungs, floor rising and falling like waves. I remember falling. The memory comes suddenly, without warning or context. Falling backward, arms windmilling uselessly, the world rotating around me in slow motion. The impact when it came was soft, cushioned by something I couldn't see, something that shouldn't have been there. Or someone. The thought arrives unbidden, unwelcome. Someone who broke my fall, absorbed the impact, made no sound as we went down together. But that can't be right. I was alone that day. I'm always alone. The kitchen table draws my attention again. The chairs haven't moved, but their shadows have shifted, grown longer and darker. One shadow stretches across the floor like a pointing finger, directing my gaze toward the basement door. The door I haven't opened in weeks, maybe months. The door that stays locked for reasons I can't remember but dare not question. The key hangs on a hook beside the door, small and silver and innocent. It would be so easy to take it down, to turn it in the lock, to descend those wooden steps into the darkness below. But my hand stops short of the key, trembling with effort or fear or something else entirely. What's down there? The question forms before I can stop it, and once it's loose in my mind, it multiplies, becomes a chorus of doubt and curiosity. What's down there? What's down there? What's down there? The basement has always been there, a part of the house's architecture, but now it feels like a presence, something alive and waiting. I remember the sound of footsteps on those wooden stairs, not my footsteps. Lighter, quicker, with a rhythm that spoke of familiarity and purpose. Someone who knew those steps well, who could navigate them in darkness without stumbling. Someone who belonged here as much as I did, maybe more. But I live alone, have always lived alone. The house is mine, the silence is mine, the secrets are mine to keep or forget as I choose. So why do I remember other footsteps, other voices, other lives intersecting with mine in ways that feel impossible but true? The refrigerator stops humming abruptly, returning the kitchen to its unnatural quiet. In the sudden silence, I hear something else. A sound so soft it might be imagination, so familiar it might be memory. Breathing that isn't mine, coming from somewhere I can't locate. I hold my own breath, listening with every fiber of my being. The sound continues, steady and rhythmic, the breathing of someone at rest, someone unafraid. It seems to come from the walls themselves, as if the house has developed lungs, learned to live and breathe and dream. The sound stops when I exhale, vanishes the moment I acknowledge it. But the feeling remains, the certainty that I'm not alone, that I never was alone, that the solitude I've wrapped around myself like armor is nothing more than elaborate self-deception. My reflection in the window has changed. The face looking back at me is older, more tired, marked by experiences I can't recall. Lines around the eyes speak of sleepless nights, of tears shed in darkness, of truths too heavy to carry in daylight. When did I become this person? When did my face learn to hold such sorrow? I turn away from the window, but the reflection follows, appearing in the chrome surface of the refrigerator, in the glass door of the microwave, in every reflective surface the kitchen offers. There's no escape from this face, this stranger who wears my features but holds secrets I've forgotten. The coat hook by the door calls to me again. The absence there is so complete it becomes a presence, a shape defined by what it lacks. I can almost see the jacket that used to hang there, can almost smell the scent that clung to its fabric. Something floral and warm, like soap and sunshine, and the kind of contentment that comes from being loved. But I don't remember being loved, don't remember loving anyone enough to let them leave their jacket by my door, their scent in my kitchen, their footsteps on my basement stairs. The memories, if they are memories, feel borrowed from someone else's life, someone who was braver than I am, more open to connection and its inevitable complications. The kitchen begins to darken as clouds gather outside the too-clean window. The light that filters through becomes gray and diffused, making shadows where there were none before. The room transforms, becomes something other than the familiar space I thought I knew. Corners deepen, walls seem to lean inward, the ceiling presses down with the weight of unspoken words. I should leave, should walk back through that unnaturally silent door and pretend this moment never happened. Should let the kitchen keep its secrets, let the basement door stay locked, let the coat hook remain empty of everything but shadows and regret. But my feet won't move. My body has become part of the house's architecture, as fixed and immutable as the walls themselves. I'm trapped by my own curiosity, held prisoner by questions I'm afraid to answer and memories I'm terrified to trust. The nausea reaches its peak, becomes something beyond physical discomfort. It's existential now, a revulsion at the very fact of my existence, at the possibility that I am not who I think I am, that the life I remember is not the life I've lived. The feeling threatens to consume me, to dissolve the boundaries between self and space, between memory and imagination. And in that moment of dissolution, I remember everything and nothing, see clearly through the fog of confusion to a truth so simple and terrible that my mind immediately begins to forget it, to bury it beneath layers of doubt and denial and the merciful amnesia of shock. The kitchen holds its breath, waiting for my decision. The basement key glints in the fading light, patient and persistent as gravity. The coat hook maintains its vigil, guardian of an absence that speaks louder than any presence could. I close my eyes, and in the darkness behind my lids, I see hands reaching for me, not in anger but in desperate love. I see a face I recognize but cannot name, eyes wide with fear and something else, something that looks like forgiveness. I see myself as I was then, in that moment when everything changed, when the person I had been died and the person I am now was born from the ashes of that death. The memory fades before I can grasp it fully, leaves me standing in the gathering darkness with empty hands and a heart full of questions that may never find their answers. The kitchen settles around me like a tomb, holding its secrets close, breathing its patient breath into the space between what was and what might have been. And still the basement door remains locked, the key untouched, the truth buried so deep that even I don't know if I want to dig it up. Story 6. The pages of the calendar rustled without a breeze, dates overlapping in an unusual collage. Each morning I brushed my teeth with a rhythmic count, only today no foam, just a dry bristle on gums. My coffee cup, always warm by 1/4 past, sat untouched and cold. Glancing at the clock, the second hand hesitated, then leapt forward, skipping beats like a faulty heart. As I reached for the remote, the television flickered on by itself, the screen reflecting a familiar scene that had never occurred. The taste of copper fills my mouth again, not blood, but something metallic and sharp, like sucking on old pennies. It's the same taste that comes back when I try to remember what happened in the basement that winter. Or was it the attic? The details shift like sand between my fingers. I keep finding myself standing at the kitchen window, staring at the backyard. The grass grows in patches there, uneven circles where nothing will take root anymore. Someone told me it was the salt they used on the walkway, but we never salted anything. I would remember that, wouldn't I? The phone rang 3 times yesterday. Each time I answered, the line went quiet except for breathing. Not heavy breathing, just the soft rhythm of someone listening. When I finally spoke, asking who was there, the sound of my own voice startled me. Had I been holding my breath too? There's a photograph tucked behind the mirror in the hallway. I discovered it while cleaning, though I don't remember putting it there. The image shows the back of someone's head, dark hair against a light background. The person seems to be walking away, but their shadow falls in the wrong direction. I've studied that shadow for what feels like hours, trying to understand why it bothers me so much. My neighbor mentioned seeing lights in my house when I was supposed to be away. She described them as moving from room to room in a pattern, like someone was searching for something. I nodded and thanked her, but inside my chest, something cold spread outward. I don't remember going anywhere. The basement door sticks now. It never used to stick. When I finally force it open, the air that rushes up smells like damp earth and something else, something familiar that makes my stomach turn. I tell myself it's just the old furnace, but furnaces don't smell like that. Sometimes I catch myself having conversations with someone who isn't there. Mid-sentence, I'll realize I'm alone in the room, my voice echoing off empty walls. The words I was speaking feel important, urgent even, but they dissolve before I can grasp their meaning. It's like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The mailbox key doesn't fit properly anymore. I have to jiggle it, twist it just so, and even then it fights me. When the box finally opens, there are letters inside addressed to someone else. Someone with my last name, but a first name I don't recognize. The handwriting on the envelopes looks familiar, though. It looks like mine. I found dirt under my fingernails this morning. Clean, dark soil that crumbles when I brush it away. My hands are soft, not the hands of someone who gardens or digs. But there it was, embedded deep beneath the surface, as if I'd been clawing at the earth. The backyard looks the same as always, those strange bare patches still visible from the kitchen window. The television turns itself on at the same time each night, always the same channel, always the same static that gradually clears into a test pattern. I've unplugged it twice, but somehow the cord finds its way back into the wall. The screen reflects my face, but the expression looking back doesn't match what I'm feeling inside. There's a voice on the answering machine that I don't remember recording. It's my voice, but saying words I never spoke, giving instructions I don't understand. Something about checking the locks, about making sure the windows stay closed. The tone is urgent, almost pleading, as if I was trying to warn myself about something. My coffee tastes different now. Same brand, same routine, but there's an underlying bitterness that wasn't there before. It reminds me of medicine or the aftertaste of fear. I've started drinking it anyway, standing at that kitchen window, watching the patches of dead grass shift in patterns that don't match the wind. The neighbors across the street have been watching my house. Not obviously, but I notice the curtains moving when I come and go. When I wave, they don't wave back. They just let the fabric fall closed and disappear into the darkness of their windows. Maybe they see the lights too, the ones that move from room to room when I'm not supposed to be home. I keep finding things in my pockets that I don't remember putting there. A smooth stone worn by water, a piece of paper with numbers written in my handwriting, a key that doesn't fit any lock in the house. Each discovery feels like a message from a version of myself I can't quite access. The clock in the hallway has started running backward. Just for a few minutes each day, the hands reverse their direction, unwinding time in small increments. I've watched it happen, mesmerized by the impossible movement. When it corrects itself, I feel like I've lost something important, some crucial moment that slipped away while the world moved in reverse. My reflection in the bathroom mirror pauses sometimes, just a fraction of a second behind my movements. It's subtle, barely noticeable, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Like my reflection is considering whether to follow along or break away entirely. The thought makes my hands shake when I reach for the toothbrush. The basement door is open again. I know I closed it, turned the handle firmly, and heard the latch click into place. But there it stands, slightly ajar, releasing that smell of damp earth and something else. Something that makes my mouth fill with the taste of copper pennies and forgotten promises. The photograph behind the mirror has changed. The person walking away is closer now, their shadow falling in a different direction entirely. Or maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe the shadow was always like that, and my mind is playing tricks on me. But tricks require a magician, and I'm alone in this house with its shifting shadows and backward clocks. I called my own phone number today and heard that strange message again, my voice giving instructions I don't remember recording. But this time there was something else in the background, a sound like digging, like metal hitting soil, rhythmic and purposeful. The sound stopped when I hung up, but the echo lingered in my ears. The taste of copper is stronger now, coating my tongue like a warning. I stand at the kitchen window, watching those patches of dead grass, and I know that something is buried there. Something that explains the lights, the photographs, the voice on the machine that sounds like me but speaks words I've never said. The calendar pages rustle again, dates overlapping in their impossible collage, and I realize that time isn't moving forward anymore. It's circling back on itself, bringing me closer to a truth I've been running from. The basement door stands open, waiting. The taste of copper fills my mouth like a promise I made to myself and forgot. But forgetting, I'm beginning to understand, doesn't make something disappear. It just buries it deeper, in places where the grass won't grow and the shadows fall in impossible directions. The television flickers on by itself, showing me scenes that never happened but feel more real than memory. I brush my teeth with that rhythmic count, but there's still no foam, just the dry scrape of bristles against truth. Story 7. It wasn't the first time the garage was left ajar. The wind had a way of catching the door, pulling it open just a crack as if inviting curious eyes. I noticed the old calendar had a new tear, pages curling like they were trying to escape. The garden hose lay coiled on the concrete, dry and unused. I walked past the stacked crates, still full, still untouched, and felt an odd sort of relief mixed with what might have been concern. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, distorting the familiar shapes. I didn't bother closing the door fully. I figured it was best if it stayed as it was. The smell lingered in my clothes afterward, not unpleasant exactly. Something like old leather mixed with dust and that metallic tang you get when you handle coins too long. I kept catching whiffs of it during dinner, between bites of soup that had grown cold while I stared at the window facing the driveway. She used to hum while doing dishes, always the same melody, something I never recognized but came to associate with the sound of running water and clinking glass. The kitchen feels different now when I wash up alone, quieter. The absence of that tune makes every small noise seem amplified. There were 3 messages on the machine when I got home that evening, 2 hang-ups and one from the insurance company asking about paperwork that should have been filed weeks ago. I played them twice, listening for something I couldn't name. Background sounds, maybe, a voice I might recognize. The neighbor across the street has been watching more often. Not obviously, but I catch the curtain moving when I check the mail or take out the trash. We used to wave to each other. Now there's just this careful distance, like we're both waiting for the other to make the first move in a game neither of us understands. I found the receipt in my jacket pocket, bleach, rope, and a bag of lime from the hardware store. My handwriting on the back, a reminder about something I can't quite recall. The paper was soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. I smoothed it out on the kitchen table and tried to remember what project had required those specific items. The phone rang during the late news. I let it go to the machine, listening to the mechanical greeting in my own voice, followed by silence, then the dial tone. Whoever it was had waited through the entire message before hanging up. This happened 3 more times before I unplugged the cord. Some nights I walk the perimeter of the property, checking the fence line, making sure the gate latch is secure. It's become a routine, though I'm not sure when it started. The motion sensor light by the back door flickers sometimes, casting moving shadows that make me pause and scan the yard more carefully. She always said I worried too much about things that didn't matter and not enough about the things that did. I think about this observation more now, turning it over like a stone I've found on the beach, smooth from handling but still somehow foreign in my palm. The detective had kind eyes. That surprised me. I'd expected someone harder, more suspicious. Instead, she sat across from me in the living room, notepad balanced on her knee, asking questions in a voice that suggested we were simply having a conversation about the weather. Most of her inquiries seemed routine. Background information, timeline clarification. When did you last see her? How did she seem? Any recent changes in behavior or mood? I answered as honestly as I could, though honesty felt slippery somehow, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Memory has a way of shifting, especially when you're asked to examine it closely. Details that seemed clear become uncertain. Conversations blur together. The sequence of events starts to feel negotiable. The crates in the garage are heavier than they look. I discovered this when I tried to move one to reach the toolbox behind it. Whatever's inside shifts when lifted, a muffled sliding sound that suggests loose objects rather than something solid. I didn't open it. Some boundaries once crossed can't be uncrossed. There's a pattern to the hang-up calls, always during dinner, always after exactly 4 rings. Whoever it is knows about the answering machine, knows how long to wait. I've started eating later, changing my routine, but the calls adjust accordingly, as if someone is watching, learning my habits. The insurance investigator was different from the detective, sharper somehow, less interested in comfort and more focused on inconsistencies. He noticed things the police had overlooked, the fresh scratches on the garage floor, the way the garden tools were arranged differently than in the photos from her social media posts, the fact that the car's odometer showed more miles than my stated activities could account for. I told him about the sleepwalking, how I'd started waking up in different parts of the house, sometimes outside, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Stress, probably. Grief manifests in strange ways. He wrote this down without comment, but I caught him glancing at my shoes, checking the soles for traces of soil or concrete dust. The basement stays cooler than the rest of the house, even in summer. I've been spending more time down there, organizing old files and boxes that have been neglected for years. It's methodical work, sorting through papers and photographs, deciding what to keep and what to discard. Some memories are easier to let go of than others. She kept a journal. I found it in her nightstand drawer while looking for the spare house keys. The entries are brief, mostly mundane observations about daily life. Doctor appointments, grocery lists, reminders about social commitments, but the tone shifts in the later entries, more cautious. References to feeling watched, to conversations that didn't quite make sense, to a growing sense that something was wrong. The last entry is just 2 words, he knows. I read this over and over, trying to understand what it means, who he might be, what exactly I'm supposed to know. The handwriting looks rushed, different from her usual careful script. There's a coffee stain in the corner of the page, as if the journal had been closed quickly, carelessly. The detective asked to see it. I told her I'd look for it, but somehow the journal never made it into the evidence box. Instead, it sits in my desk drawer, wrapped in a plastic bag to preserve whatever fingerprints or DNA might still cling to the pages. Insurance, maybe, or evidence of something I'm not ready to confront. Sleep comes in fragments now. I'll drift off in the chair while watching television, then wake with a start around 3 in the morning, disoriented and cold. The house settles differently at night, creaking and sighing in ways I never noticed before. Every sound requires investigation, even though I never find anything out of place. The garage door was open again this morning, wider this time, enough for someone to slip through without having to duck. The crates had been disturbed, moved slightly but carefully, as if someone had been searching for something specific. I found footprints in the dust, too large to be mine, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left sole. I should call the police, I know this, but what would I tell them? That someone might have been in my garage. That things feel different, but I can't explain how. That I'm finding evidence of activities I don't remember performing. They'd ask questions I'm not prepared to answer, make connections I'm not ready to examine. The neighbor stopped me while I was bringing in the mail. Casual conversation at first, comments about the weather and the condition of the street after the recent storms. Then more carefully, questions about whether everything was all right, if I needed any help with anything, if there was anything I wanted to talk about. Her concern felt genuine, but there was something else underneath it. Fear maybe, or knowledge she wasn't ready to share. I thanked her and said everything was fine. We both knew I was lying. The insurance money would solve a lot of problems. The mortgage, the credit cards, the medical bills that have been accumulating faster than I can pay them. It would buy time, space to figure out what comes next. But first there has to be a death certificate, and for that there has to be a body. The investigator called it a waiting game. These cases sometimes resolve themselves. people turn up or evidence surfaces that clarifies what happened. But the longer the delay, the more complicated things become. Assumptions harden into facts. Theories develop their own momentum. I dream about the crates sometimes. In the dreams, I know exactly what's inside them, but I wake before I can remember the details. Just the weight of knowledge, heavy and specific, and the certainty that opening them would change everything. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The calls have stopped 3 days now without a single hang-up. The silence feels more ominous than the interruptions did, as if whoever was testing me has gotten the information they needed and moved on to the next phase of whatever plan they're executing. I found myself back in the garage this evening, standing among the crates and tools, trying to remember what I'd been doing there. The concrete floor was damp in places, though it hadn't rained in over a week. The smell was stronger, more distinct, not leather and dust after all, but something else. Something that made me step back toward the door, toward the fading light of dusk. The detective called to schedule another interview. Routine follow-up, she said, but her voice carried a different quality now, more formal, less conversational. They've found something, or someone has told them something, or the investigation has shifted in a direction that makes me more than just a concerned party. I agreed to meet with her tomorrow afternoon. Tonight I'll walk the property one more time, checking the fence line, testing the gate latch, making sure everything is secure. The motion sensor light will flicker as I pass beneath it, casting my shadow long and distorted across the yard. In the morning I'll close the garage door properly, though I suspect it will find its way open again before long. The wind has a way of catching it, pulling it ajar, as if something inside is trying to get out. Story 8. The wind rustled gently through the branches, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and pine needles as it entered the room. The lace curtains fluttered in a rhythmic dance, but the window was firmly shut and latched. On the wooden floor, a faint trail of petals led to an untouched bookcase, their vibrant colors stark against the dark grain. Everything in the room appeared undisturbed, yet an unsettling stillness hung in the air, like a held breath waiting to be released. I found them this morning, those petals, red and yellow, scattered like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale that ends badly. The kind of flowers she used to press between the pages of her journals, the ones I never read until after. But that comes later, or maybe it came before. Memory has a way of folding in on itself when you've spent too many nights trying to piece together what you missed. The room belongs to me now, though I'm not sure it ever really belonged to her. She rented it from the old woman downstairs, paid in cash every month, never late. I know this because I found the receipts tucked inside a cookbook that showed no signs of use. The binding was pristine, the pages unmarked except for a single recipe circled in red ink. Strawberry preserves. She never made preserves. When I try to remember when the suspicion started, my mind goes to the sound of her humming. Not the melody itself, which was always changing, but the timing. She hummed when she was nervous, when her fingers drummed against surfaces without rhythm. The kitchen counter, the steering wheel, the edge of the bathtub while I brushed my teeth in the mornings. I thought it was endearing then, this unconscious music she made when she thought no one was listening. But I was always listening. The petals are wilted now, their edges brown and curling inward like secrets being whispered. I've counted them 17 times since dawn, and the number never changes. 43 petals from flowers that don't grow anywhere near this house. The nearest florist is miles away, and she never drove there. I would have known. I kept track of the mileage on her car, not because I didn't trust her, but because I worried about her driving alone at night. The roads here curve through dense woods, where cell service dies and headlights barely penetrate the darkness. Or maybe I did it because I didn't trust her. The bookcase holds mostly paperbacks, their spines faded from sunlight that streams through the window during certain hours. I've pulled each one out, shaken it for loose papers, notes, anything that might explain the petals or the way she looked at me during those final weeks. Her eyes had changed, become distant, like she was seeing something just over my shoulder. When I turned to look, there was never anything there. Romance novels mostly, stories about women who disappear into new lives, who reinvent themselves in small towns where nobody asks questions. I wonder now if she was researching, planning. The margins are clean, but some pages have been dog-eared. Chapter endings mostly, places where one story ends and another begins. I should mention the photographs, though I'm not sure when I first noticed them were wrong. She kept them in a shoebox under the bed, hundreds of pictures spanning what I thought was her entire life. Family gatherings, college friends, vacation snapshots from places I'd never been. But when I looked closer, really looked, I realized she appeared in only half of them. In the others, there was always a space where someone had been carefully cut out. The scissors had been precise, leaving clean edges that suggested patience rather than anger. The woman downstairs claims she never saw anyone else visit the room. Just my wife coming and going at odd hours, always carrying a small bag that clinked softly when she walked, like glass bottles touching. The old woman has cataracts, though, and admits her hearing isn't what it used to be. She might have missed things. People have a way of not seeing what doesn't fit their expectations. I found the bag eventually, hidden behind a loose board in the closet. 7 small bottles, each containing what looked like pressed flowers suspended in clear liquid. The labels were handwritten in a script I didn't recognize, though something about the loops and crosses seemed familiar, like handwriting I'd seen in dreams. The preserves recipe calls for pectin, sugar, and fresh fruit, simple ingredients for something meant to last, but the circles around the words tell a different story. Red ink, the same shade as the petals, emphasizing phrases like seal tightly and store in a cool, dark place. Instructions that could mean anything if you were looking for hidden messages. And I was always looking. She started working late 6 months before she disappeared. New project, she said, something about organizing old files for a law firm across town. I offered to drive her to wait in the car, but she insisted on going alone. Said the work required concentration, that having me there would be distracting. I understood. I've always been the type to hover, to ask too many questions. But the law firm had no record of employing her. I called them after the first week of silence, when her phone went straight to voicemail and her side of the bed grew cold. The receptionist was polite but firm. No one by that name had ever worked there, not as an employee or contractor. They suggested I might have the wrong firm, that maybe she worked for one of their competitors. I spent 2 days calling every legal office in a 50-mile radius. The answer was always the same. The petals seemed to glow in the afternoon light, their colors more vivid against the dark wood floor. I've tried to trace their path backward, to imagine how they got here, but the trail starts at the door and ends at the bookcase with no indication of direction. They could have been dropped by someone entering or leaving, or scattered deliberately to create this breadcrumb path that leads nowhere. Her journal entries stopped 3 weeks before she vanished, but the final entry is just a list of numbers, coordinates maybe, or dates written in code. I've tried every combination I can think of, plugged them into mapping websites, treated them as phone numbers or addresses. Nothing leads anywhere real. The numbers exist in that space between meaning and nonsense, like everything else she left behind. The old woman downstairs remembers the sound of footsteps in the middle of the night, pacing back and forth across the floor above her bedroom. She assumed it was my wife having trouble sleeping, but now I wonder if someone else was here, walking the same path the petals trace. 43 steps from door to bookcase if you measure carefully and don't count the places where the floorboards creak. I've walked that path myself countless times, trying to understand what drew someone to that particular corner of the room. The bookcase holds no secrets I can find, just stories about women who disappear and start over somewhere else. But maybe that was the secret. Maybe she was studying their methods, learning how to vanish without leaving traces that pointed anywhere real. The bottles in the bag smell like flowers and something else, something chemical that makes my eyes water. I opened one despite knowing I shouldn't disturb potential evidence. The liquid inside was clear as water, but thick, almost syrupy. When I held it up to the light, tiny particles swirled like snow in a globe. Flower petals, I thought at first, but they moved wrong, too uniform, too deliberate. The police took statements, filed reports, assured me they would investigate thoroughly. But what is there to investigate when someone simply isn't there anymore? Her car was found at the train station, keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat with her identification intact. The security cameras showed her walking toward the platform, but she never boarded any train. She simply walked out of frame and never walked back in. Like she knew exactly where the cameras couldn't see. I sleep in this room sometimes, on the narrow bed she rented along with everything else. The mattress holds the faint impression of a body, though I can't tell if it's hers or mine or someone else entirely. The sheets smell like the flowers in those bottles, sweet and chemical and wrong. When I close my eyes, I can almost hear her humming, that nervous melody that meant she was planning something. The preserves recipe is more complicated than I first realized. The instructions include warnings about temperature, timing, the importance of sterilizing everything that touches the fruit. One mistake and the whole batch spoils, becomes something dangerous instead of nourishing. I wonder if she ever tried to make them, if she understood the risks involved in trying to preserve something that was meant to be temporary. Her phone records show calls to numbers that don't exist anymore, disconnected lines that lead nowhere. I've tried calling them anyway, hoping someone might answer, might explain what she was planning during those final weeks. But there's only silence, the kind that suggests the numbers were never meant to be permanent. Temporary connections for temporary conversations about things that couldn't be discussed on lines that might be monitored. The old woman downstairs is moving out next month. She says the house feels different now, empty in ways that have nothing to do with vacancy. I understand what she means. Rooms hold onto the people who lived in them, but this room feels like it's holding onto someone who was never really here, like she was already gone before she left. I've started keeping my own journal, writing down everything I remember about those final weeks. But memory is unreliable, especially when you're trying to remember things that might not have happened the way you thought they did. Did she really work late, or was that just what she told me? Did I really check the mileage on her car, or did I just think about checking it? The line between what I knew and what I suspected has blurred beyond recognition. The bottles are gone now. I turned them over to the police, though I'm not sure what they'll find. The liquid evaporated quickly once exposed to air, leaving only residue that might have been anything. Flower petals, chemicals, the remnants of someone's attempt to preserve something that couldn't be saved. Evidence of what I can't say. But the petals remain, 43 pieces of a puzzle that might not have a solution. They've dried completely now, brittle enough to crumble at a touch. I've thought about sweeping them up, disposing of them like the remnants they are, but something stops me every time I reach for the broom. They're the only proof I have that any of this was real, that she was here, that someone scattered them for reasons I may never understand. The wind has picked up outside, rattling the windows and making the curtains dance even though they're closed. The same wind that brought the smell of earth and pine needles, the scent of places far from this room where flowers grow wild, and people can disappear without leaving trails of breadcrumbs behind them. I found them this morning, those petals, scattered like answers to questions I never thought to ask. Red and yellow against dark wood, vibrant as secrets, brittle as trust. The wind rustles through the branches outside, carrying with it the promise of seasons changing, of things that bloom and fade and leave only traces of their passing. Everything in this room appears undisturbed, yet the stillness holds its breath, waiting for something that may never come, may have already passed, may be happening right now in the space between one moment and the next. Story 9. The weight of what we don't see. The needle on the wall clock quivered, paused, then juddered forward as if unsure of itself. The freshness of morning was tinged with the scent of forgotten evenings, and the hallway mirror, always faithfully upright, leaned just slightly off kilter. My steps echoed twice, once behind and once ahead, leading me into rooms that felt both lived in and untouched, their shadows retreating hesitantly. A floorboard creaked as I shifted my weight, but the sound came from the floor beneath. Was it supposed to? In the corner of my eye, the curtains swayed, though the windows remained resolutely shut. When I glanced back, my reflection was waiting, already turning away. I had been a crime scene photographer for over a decade, but this house felt different. The call came in during the early morning hours, a routine domestic incident that would require documentation before the investigators arrived. What I found was a living room that looked like someone had simply stepped out for a moment, leaving behind a cup of coffee still warm to the touch, and a newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle, half completed in blue ink. The victim was a woman in her 40s, found by her neighbor after she failed to show up for their regular morning walk. The neighbor had used a spare key, calling out as she entered, her voice echoing through rooms that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. What struck me first wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass or displaced objects. Just a woman lying peacefully on her bedroom floor as if she had simply decided to rest there. The detective assigned to the case was a weathered man with tired eyes who spoke in measured tones. He walked through the house with the careful steps of someone who had seen too much, his fingers trailing along surfaces as if reading stories written in dust and fingerprints. When he spoke to me, his words came slowly, each one chosen with deliberation. "Take your pictures," he said, "but pay attention to the details. Sometimes what looks normal is the most disturbing thing of all." I began my work methodically, capturing angles and perspectives that would later be examined by people who hadn't stood in these rooms, hadn't felt the weight of their strange normalcy. Through my lens, I noticed things that my naked eye had missed. A slight indentation in the carpet near the bedroom door, as if someone had stood there for a long while. A single strand of hair caught on the door frame, too light in color to belong to the victim. A prescription bottle on the nightstand, turned so its label faced away from the bed. The victim's sister arrived while I was still working. She moved through the house like a ghost, touching objects with trembling fingers, her breath catching on words that wouldn't form properly. She kept repeating that something wasn't right, that her sister would never have left things this way. The coffee cup was in the wrong place. The newspaper was folded differently than usual. Even the way the curtains hung seemed foreign to her. She was meticulous, the sister whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling sounds of the house. Everything had its place, its purpose. This looks like her life, but it feels like a stage set. I found myself studying the photographs I had taken, enlarging them on my computer screen back at the office. The more I looked, the more questions emerged. Why was there no dust on the coffee table when every other surface showed signs of normal accumulation? Why did the victim's shoes sit so perfectly aligned by the front door when the sister insisted she always kicked them off carelessly? Why did the bed appear to have been made with military precision when family members described her as someone who rarely bothered with such details? The autopsy report, when it finally came, raised more questions than it answered. No obvious cause of death, no signs of trauma or poisoning. The toxicology results showed only trace amounts of a common sleep aid, well within therapeutic levels. The victim's heart was healthy, her organs functioning normally at the time of death. It was as if life had simply decided to leave her body, offering no explanation for its departure. I began visiting the neighborhood, talking to people who lived nearby, trying to piece together the victim's final days. What I discovered was a pattern of subtle strangeness that seemed to follow her everywhere. The grocery store clerk remembered her last visit, noting that she had purchased items she never bought before: expensive wine, fresh flowers, ingredients for elaborate meals. The pharmacist recalled filling a prescription for sleeping pills, even though the victim had never requested such medication previously. Her coworkers described changes in her behavior during the weeks leading up to her death. She had become more withdrawn, more careful about locking her office door, more reluctant to engage in casual conversation. Several mentioned that she seemed to be listening for something, her head tilted slightly as if catching sounds that others couldn't hear. One colleague remembered her mentioning a feeling of being watched, but when pressed for details, the victim had simply shrugged and changed the subject. The investigation officially stalled after several weeks. Without clear evidence of foul play, the case was classified as death by undetermined causes. The detective moved on to other matters. The family held a quiet funeral and the house was put up for sale, but I couldn't let it go. Something in those photographs continued to nag at me, a detail hiding in plain sight, waiting to be recognized. I returned to the house one afternoon, using the key the family had given me to retrieve some personal items they had forgotten. The new owners hadn't moved in yet, and the empty rooms felt even more unsettled than they had with furniture and personal belongings. My footsteps echoed differently now, creating rhythms that seemed to answer themselves from other parts of the house. Standing in the bedroom where the victim had been found, I noticed something I had missed before. The carpet showed wear patterns that didn't match the room's current layout. Furniture had been moved recently and deliberately. Someone had rearranged the space before the body was discovered, creating the scene I had photographed. The realization hit me like cold water. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a carefully constructed tableau. I began examining my photographs with new eyes, looking for other signs of staging. The coffee cup's placement perfectly centered on a coaster. The newspaper folded with creases too sharp for casual reading. The prescription bottle positioned so its contents couldn't be easily identified. Even the victim's position on the floor seemed too composed, too peaceful for someone who had died unexpectedly. The question became not who had killed her, but who had arranged the scene afterward. Someone with access to the house, someone who knew her habits well enough to create a believable replica of her daily routine. Someone who cared enough about her reputation to ensure she was found in dignity, surrounded by the trappings of a normal life. I thought about the neighbor who had discovered the body, the sister who had seemed so disturbed by the scene's wrongness, the co-workers who had noticed changes in behavior. Each of them had access to information about the victim's life. Each had opportunities to observe her routines. Each had reasons to protect her memory. The sleeping pills became a focal point of my investigation. The prescription was recent, filled just days before the victim's death, but the bottle in the bedroom contained far fewer pills than it should have. Either she had taken more than the therapeutic dose, or someone had removed evidence of a larger consumption. The autopsy's toxicology results suddenly seemed less conclusive. more like a carefully crafted misdirection. I spoke again with the pharmacist, this time asking different questions. Had anyone else inquired about the victim's prescriptions? Had there been any unusual requests for information about drug interactions or dosing schedules? The pharmacist's answers were careful, professional, but I caught glimpses of recognition in his eyes, moments when he seemed to be weighing what he could safely reveal. Privacy laws, he said repeatedly. I can't discuss specific patients or their medications. But his tone suggested there was more he wanted to say, information that regulations prevented him from sharing. When I pressed gently, he mentioned that the victim hadn't been the only one asking questions about sleep aids recently. Someone else had been researching their effects, their detectability, their potential for masking other substances. The investigation was becoming a maze of possibilities, each lead branching into new questions, each answer revealing additional mysteries. I found myself questioning my own memories of that first morning in the house, wondering if my initial impressions had been influenced by expectations rather than observations. Had the scene really felt staged, or was I imposing that interpretation after the fact? I decided to approach the victim's sister again, this time with specific questions about the rearranged furniture and the inconsistencies she had noticed. Her reaction was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath, a step backward, a hand pressed to her chest as if protecting her heart from what I was suggesting. "You think someone moved things around after she died," she whispered. "You think someone was in there with her, arranging everything to look normal." The possibility seemed to terrify her more than the original death had. The idea that someone had spent time with her sister's body, carefully positioning objects and adjusting details, transformed the scene from tragedy to violation. But it also opened new avenues of investigation, new questions about timing and access and motivation. Who would have had the key? Who would have known the victim's routines well enough to recreate them? Who would have cared enough about appearances to spend precious time staging a scene when discovery was imminent? The answers pointed toward someone close to the victim, someone who loved her enough to protect her even in death. The neighbor who had found the body became my primary focus. She had access through the spare key, intimate knowledge of the victim's habits from their daily walks, an opportunity during the crucial window between death and discovery. But her grief seemed genuine, her shock at finding the body appeared real, and her cooperation with the investigation had been complete and voluntary. I began to consider the possibility that the staging hadn't been done to conceal a crime, but to preserve dignity. Perhaps the victim had died in circumstances that would have been embarrassing or painful for her family to discover. Perhaps someone who cared about her had taken it upon themselves to create a more peaceful final tableau, one that would spare her loved ones additional trauma. This theory led me back to the prescription medication and the victim's changed behavior in her final weeks. What if she had been struggling with something, depression, anxiety, insomnia, that she had kept hidden from her family? What if her death, while not technically suicide, had been the result of her attempts to self-medicate? What if someone had found her and, out of love and protection, had arranged the scene to suggest a more natural passing? The more I investigated, the more I realized that the truth might be more complex than simple murder or natural death. The victim's final weeks painted a picture of someone under stress, someone dealing with pressures she couldn't or wouldn't share with others. The staged scene might have been an act of compassion rather than concealment, a final gift from someone who understood her need for privacy, even in death. But questions remained. If the scene had been staged out of love, why hadn't that person come forward to explain? Why allow the family to suffer through an inconclusive investigation when a simple explanation might have provided closure? Why risk potential criminal charges for tampering with evidence when honesty might have been met with understanding? The case consumed my thoughts for months, becoming more than a professional obligation and transforming into a personal obsession. I found myself returning to the house repeatedly, even after it had been sold and occupied by new owners. I would drive past slowly, studying the windows and doors, wondering if the walls still held secrets that I hadn't been able to uncover. The new residents, when I finally worked up the courage to approach them, reported nothing unusual about the house. No strange sounds, no unsettling atmospheres, no sense of unfinished business lingering in the rooms. Whatever had happened there seemed to have resolved itself, leaving behind only an ordinary home with an extraordinary history. I eventually had to accept that some questions might never be answered, some mysteries might never be solved. The victim's death remained officially undetermined, the staging of the scene remained unproven, and the identity of whoever had cared enough to protect her final dignity remained unknown. But the case had taught me something important about the nature of truth and the complexity of human relationships. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to ensure their story ends the way they would have wanted it told. Sometimes protecting someone's memory is more important than revealing every detail of their final moments. Sometimes the greatest crime isn't the taking of a life, but the violation of someone's right to leave this world with grace and privacy intact. The photographs I had taken that morning still sit in my files, evidence of a scene that may or may not have been authentic. When I look at them now, I see not just the documentation of a potential crime, but the record of someone's final act of love. Whether that love came from family, friend, or stranger, it transformed a potentially tragic discovery into something peaceful and dignified. The truth, whatever it was, died with the victim and whoever staged that final scene. All that remains is the mystery, the questions, and the haunting possibility that sometimes the most beautiful crimes are those committed not out of hatred or greed, but out of an overwhelming desire to protect someone we care about, even after they can no longer protect themselves. Story 10. I stood silent, my eyes fixed on the cracked window pane, waiting for a soundless shiver that never came. The room around me held its breath, walls creaking under a weight I couldn't see. The air felt loaded like static before a storm, yet nothing stirred. Shadows draped themselves lazily, pooling in corners, while an invisible presence seemed to push them aside. I waited, my pulse in sync with the creaking floorboards for the cue to act. And then out of the silence, a curtain edge flicked not from the wind, but from something unseen moving past. That was the moment I knew she was hiding from him. The certainty of it settled in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. I'd seen her slip through the back door of the old house 3 blocks from the diner where she worked the night shift. Her movements were deliberate, practiced, the way someone moves when they've rehearsed an escape route in their mind 100 times. The house belonged to her aunt, though the woman had been in the care facility for months now. Perfect hiding spot, empty enough to avoid attention, familiar enough that she could navigate it in the dark. I'd watched her check the windows twice before settling into what I assumed was the front room, the one with the heavy curtains that hadn't been opened since her aunt took that fall. He'd been looking for her for 3 days straight. I'd seen him cruise past the diner during her usual shifts, park outside her apartment building, even walk through the grocery store where she sometimes picked up extra work stocking shelves. His car, that dented blue sedan with the loose muffler, had become as familiar to me as my own reflection. The desperation in his movements grew more pronounced each day she stayed hidden. The restraining order was supposed to keep him away, but paper doesn't stop obsession. I'd seen enough cases like this to know how they usually ended. The pattern was always the same: escalation, desperation, then something that made the local news for exactly one news cycle before everyone moved on to the next tragedy. But she was smart. She'd planned this well. The house gave her multiple exit points, and the neighborhood was quiet enough that she'd hear his car coming from blocks away. All she had to do was wait him out until the police could track him down, or until he gave up and moved on to easier prey. I settled back against the tree across the street, confident in my assessment of the situation. The streetlight threw just enough illumination to keep the front of the house visible, but not enough to expose my position. I'd brought coffee in a thermos and a jacket warm enough for the cool night air. This was going to be a long watch, but I was prepared. That's when I first noticed something that didn't quite fit. The curtain movement I'd seen hadn't been random. It followed a pattern, a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. 3 quick movements, then a pause. 3 more, another pause, like a signal or a code. But who was she signaling to? I shifted my position slightly, trying to get a better angle on the house. The windows were dark except for the faint glow that might have been a small flashlight or the screen of a phone. She was being careful not to attract attention, which made sense, but the curtain signals bothered me. If she was hiding, why risk any movement that might give away her position? Then I heard his car. The loose muffler announced his presence 2 streets away, that distinctive rattling growl that had become the soundtrack to her fear. I watched the house, expecting to see her freeze, maybe move away from the windows entirely. Instead, the curtain movements became more frequent, more urgent. His headlights swept across the street as he turned the corner, but instead of slowing down as he passed the house, he accelerated. The blue sedan disappeared around the next corner without so much as a pause. He hadn't even glanced toward the house where she was hiding. That was strange. In the previous 3 days, he'd driven past every location where she might be at least twice, sometimes sitting parked for hours. He'd shown the obsessive thoroughness that made these situations so dangerous. Why would he suddenly overlook such an obvious hiding spot? Unless he already knew she wasn't there. Or unless he knew exactly where she was, and it wasn't in that house. I found myself studying the building with different eyes. The aunt's house was a perfect hiding spot, but it was also a perfect trap. One way in, limited sight lines, neighbors who minded their own business. If someone wanted to corner her, to have a conversation without interruption, it would be ideal for that purpose too. The curtain movements had stopped entirely now. The house sat in complete stillness, and for the first time since I'd taken up my position, I wondered if anyone was actually inside. I thought back to what I'd seen earlier, a figure slipping through the back door, moving with familiar confidence through a dark house. I'd assumed it was her because I'd expected it to be her, but I'd been watching from across the street, in limited light, seeing what I anticipated seeing rather than what was actually there. The person I'd watched enter the house had been wearing dark clothing, moving quickly and quietly. Those details fit her, but they'd fit a lot of people. The build had seemed right, the height approximately correct, but those weren't exactly unique identifiers. What if I'd been watching the wrong person this entire time? I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through the photos I'd taken over the past few days. There he was outside the diner, sitting in his car with the engine running. There he was walking through the grocery store, scanning the aisles with systematic determination. And there, in the background of one of the grocery store shots, was someone else entirely. She was in the pharmacy section, partially obscured by a display of seasonal items, but unmistakably present. The timestamp on the photo showed this was taken while he was in the same store, supposedly looking for her. But she'd been there all along, close enough to observe him, far enough away to avoid being seen. Unless she hadn't been avoiding being seen. Unless she'd been studying him the same way I'd been studying both of them. I looked back at the house with growing unease. If she hadn't been hiding from him, then who had I watched enter the building, and why had they wanted me to think it was her? The realization crept over me slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. I'd been so focused on the drama I thought I was witnessing that I'd missed the actual story unfolding around me. The restraining order, the systematic searching, the apparent desperation, all of it could be read in completely different ways. What if he wasn't hunting her? What if she was hunting him? The restraining order could have been strategic, a way to establish a pattern of harassment that would look compelling to investigators later. His searching could have been defensive, trying to figure out where the next confrontation would come from, and his desperation might not have been the obsession of a stalker, but the fear of someone who knew they were being stalked. I thought about the curtain signals again. 3 movements, pause, 3 more movements, not a call for help, but a signal that the target was in position. A confirmation that he'd driven past as expected, that the plan was proceeding as intended. But if that was true, then who was I? The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so certain of my role as an observer, a witness to events that needed witnessing. But observers don't just happen to be in the right place at the right time with thermoses of coffee and warm jackets. Observers don't have detailed knowledge of restraining orders and work schedules and family properties. I tried to remember how I'd first learned about the situation. Had someone told me about it? Had I stumbled across it by accident? The memory felt slippery, like trying to hold onto something covered in oil. I remembered knowing about it, but I couldn't pinpoint the moment when that knowledge had begun. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, no words, just an address. The address of the house I was watching. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The message had been sent from inside the house. Someone in there knew I was out here, knew my phone number, knew I was watching. The smart thing would have been to leave, to get in my car and drive away and let whatever was happening happen without me. But I found myself walking toward the house instead, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old furniture and something else, something organic that I couldn't identify. My footsteps sounded too loud on the hardwood floors, but I couldn't seem to move any more quietly. The living room was empty, but there were signs of recent occupation. A dent in the couch cushions, still warm to the touch. A glass of water on the side table, condensation still beating on the outside. And on the windowsill, a small device that looked like a motion detector, its red light blinking steadily. I'd been watching. The sound of a car engine outside made me freeze. The loose muffler announced his return, but this time the engine shut off in front of the house. Car door slamming, footsteps on the front walk, the scrape of a key in the lock. He walked in like he owned the place, like he'd been expected. When he saw me standing in his aunt's living room, he didn't look surprised. "You came," he said, and his voice carried relief rather than anger. I wasn't sure the message would be enough. "Your aunt's house," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "She's been gone for months, perfect place for a private conversation." He sat down heavily on the couch, and I could see the exhaustion in his shoulders. "Do you know how long she's been following me?" documenting everything I do, everywhere I go. I thought about the photos on my phone, the systematic documentation of his movements, the restraining order. Was her idea from the start, establish the pattern, create the narrative, make me look like the dangerous one? He rubbed his face with both hands. I got the order to stay away from her, so I did, but she didn't stay away from me. The signals in the window. Letting you know I was coming, she needed a witness for whatever she had planned next. He looked up at me with eyes that held a question I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. The question is, are you here because you chose to be, or because she convinced you that you chose to be? I tried to remember making the decision to watch the house, to bring the thermos, to position myself across the street. The memory felt manufactured, like a story I'd been told rather than something I'd experienced. Where is she now? I asked. I was hoping you could tell me. He stood up, moved to the window, peered out through the curtains. She's been one step ahead this entire time. The only reason I came here was because I knew you'd be watching, and I figured if anyone knew where she really was, it would be you. But I didn't know. I realized I'd never actually seen her, not clearly, not in a way that would hold up under scrutiny. I'd seen shapes in shadows, figures in peripheral vision, assumptions made solid by expectation. Check your phone, he said quietly. Another message, same unknown number. This time it was a photo taken from outside the house. It showed both of us through the window, him standing, me sitting, looking for all the world like a planned meeting between conspirators. She's still watching, I said. She's always watching. He moved away from the window. The question is, what does she want us to do next? I looked around the room, at the motion detector still blinking on the windowsill, at the glass of water that someone had placed there for a reason, at the two of us brought together by circumstances that felt less coincidental with each passing moment. Outside, a car started up somewhere in the distance, not the rattling muffler of his sedan, but something quieter, more expensive. The sound faded as it drove away, leaving us alone in the house with our questions and the growing certainty that we'd been playing parts in someone else's script. The motion detector's red light blinked steadily, recording everything, sending the data somewhere we couldn't see. And in the silence that followed, I began to understand that the real question wasn't where she was, or what she wanted, or even who was the victim and who was the perpetrator. The real question was whether we were supposed to figure it out, or whether our confusion was exactly the point.